Morning guys, we're back here again. Going to talk a little bit this time about medieval archery. So bow and arrow, hopefully these are fairly recognisable items to you. But before we get into kind of the medieval side of things and how they were used in warfare during the Wars of the Roses and other periods, I want to go back into the history of it. So these things didn't just appear out of nowhere. There's a long history in human evolution and human society about using the bow and arrow. Now, one of the oldest finds that we've got for not necessarily bow and arrow, but the actual tip, so the arrow head made out of flint, is around 64,000 years ago. So we know that humans were using these kind of pieces of equipment to go hunting all sorts of different kind of animals, from very small things like rabbits through to sort of large deer. So the history of the bow and arrow is huge and spans an enormous amount of human civilization. So before we had cities, before we had farming, before we had cows and cattle, we had the bow and arrow. Okay, so this is sort of a really ancient part of our society, a part of our civilization. If we want to go forward a bit, the oldest actual bow that we find in history is around 7,000 years ago, coming out of Denmark. So it was preserved in damp, clay, boggy material, and some of the wood was still survived after all that time. It was excavated during the World War II, or just around World War II, and it was 7,000 years old. So again, there's sort of a long history. It wasn't just something we used for a little bit, used throughout history. And it was developed all over the world. You can go into places like Australia, where civilization was very isolated for thousands of years. You can see it in Africa, you can see it in Americas, you can see it in Central Europe, in Eastern Europe, all over the world. And this wasn't necessarily people kind of communicating and trading. We think that these ideas were found independently by all of these people throughout time. So it's an incredibly useful piece of equipment to go hunting with. Now, as we develop through time, obviously hunting animals turned into civilization, we turned into farming, we started to develop settled communities, and those communities had resources that need to be protected. So we started to come up with kind of military forces, and the bow and arrow shifted from being used just for hunting to being used in a military aspect as well. And that's what we're going to talk about today, the medieval archer. So the period that I kind of know the most about is around the 15th century, but the bow and arrow was used extensively before that in the 14th and the 13th century. It was used very heavily in England, and beyond that into the 16th century in parts of Europe as well as predominantly in England. The archer that you see in England is the common man. So he's not gentry, he's not nobility, he's the man on the street, he's a blacksmith, he's a potter, he's a tradesman, he's a farmer. And because of the military system we had in the medieval period, at certain times the noblemen of the country would call these men up and they would be obliged to serve in the military. They'd be paid for their time, but it was kind of like national service. They would be applied and pushed into the military for a period of time for a certain military campaign, and then when that was done, if they survived, they'd go back to their normal day job. But if you want to have an archer in an army who's actually able to hit something, you can't just conscript them into the army, give them a bow and arrow and send them onto the way. They need to be trained, and to use a bow and arrow takes an enormous amount of training. It's not as simple as a rifle or a firearm that you see today. You have to start training incredibly early. So the archers that we see in the medieval period, they began training from the age of around 7 or 8. So when you're old enough that you've got a little bit of power in the shoulders, a little bit of muscle in the arms, they started to train these archers. And all around England, if you sort of look through old towns and old cities, there'll be streets and roads and places called Butt Lane, Butt End, Butt Alley, and these were the butts. So these are the archery butts. This is where these boys would train, and they would be obliged under law to train every Sunday and every holy day. And in the medieval calendar there was an awful lot of religious holy days. So it was maybe 2 or 3 times a week these boys would go down to the butts, and they would take their bows, probably as small as this to start with, and they'd take their arrow and they would start loosing those arrows. As they get older, each year, whoever is responsible for them, so their father or whoever they're apprenticed to perhaps, they would be buying them a larger and larger bow. So as the boy grows and their power and their muscles grow, so too does the bow. So by the time they get to the age of 16, which is when they're eligible to serve in the military, these guys are very powerful they've got instinctual movement. So what I'm talking about is when you're looking down a rifle, you sight and you hold and you wait and you follow and then you shoot. With a bow and arrow, you've spent nearly 10 years training. By the time you're 20, 30, 40, you've got decades of training, and that aiming system becomes instinctual. You don't hold the bow out like they do in Hollywood and they go hold, hold, and you're looking down the arrow and sighting it. It's completely muscle memory instinctual. You draw, you look, you sight at your target and you loose away. Now with a lot of shooting, people tell you to lead the target, try and trace in front of it, look at the speed it's going. With this bow and arrow, it's so ingrained in the system, in the way that you're targeting. All you're doing is looking at it and loosing. That ability to target and find your mark is incredibly easy when you've done it for decades. And there's all sorts of training methods that we'll go into on another little section to tell you a little bit more about it. But that's a little bit of the history of how we get to the medieval period, how we get to the bow and arrow, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the equipment and the archer in another video in a moment.